Welcome to this week's episode of the Maine Challenge. So when it comes to electricity, there are two things I care about. I want to make sure it's reliable, and I want to make sure I can afford it. So Central Maine Power is my provider, and it is for most of the people of Maine or Versant. And both of those things, we rank almost dead last in the nation, both for price and reliability. So what's an alternative? This week, we talked to folks who are working on Pine Tree Power, which is proposing to move us from an investor-owned utility like CMP and Versant to a consumer-owned utility, which is a utility that would be owned by the people. We're going to talk with Nicole Grohoski about the overall vision of what this means. We'll get to talk with Silkman, who is an economist, to talk about what the money part of it is and how can we make this actually work? Can we actually do this? And lastly, we talk with some young people who care about this, not just for their bills and for electricity and broadband, but also about how it will affect climate change. Lastly, I sound off about how for-profit utilities is a good example of capitalism gone amok. So stay tuned. We've got a good one for you, and it matters to you every single day. Thanks for joining us. So I'm very happy to welcome to the show Representative Nicole Grohoski, who is from District 132 up in Ellsworth and Trenton, and is a member of the Energy, Technology, and Utilities Committee, and is awesome. She is just an awesome legislator, and she's working very hard on the bringing about Pine Tree Power, a consumer-owned utility. So Nicole, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here today. Thanks, Betsy.
Good to have you. So Nicole, a lot of people, so right now, most people in Maine are represented or get their electricity from either Central Maine Power or Versant. I know there's a couple others, but that's where they mostly get it. And so now tell us what the purpose of Pine Tree Power is and what you're trying to do, what it's trying to do.
Sure. So Central Maine Power and Versant Power are two utilities that, as you said, service most people in Maine. And those utilities are both investor-owned utilities. That means that people who are not Maine people are making decisions about what the utility will do for services and for upgrades and for clean energy. And they're making those decisions for the benefit of their shareholders. That's what they're designed to do. But as you alluded to, there are other Mainers that have a different utility model, and that utility model is called a consumer-owned utility. And in that case, it's just like it sounds. The consumers actually own the utility. They're usually managed through elected boards. So local people are making decisions for their neighbors and for themselves. And many communities in Maine, around 100 actually, are served by consumer-owned utilities, including near where I live, Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, which is about, I think it's bigger than the size of Rhode Island. It serves a very rural area, but it is able to do so more affordably than the Versant territory, which is what I live in, and also has better service. So when there's a storm or other power outages, they're just much faster at getting the customers back online. So there's basically two different utility models, and what Pine Tree Power is trying to do is create the consumer utility model for all the Maine people who don't yet have it.
And so is it, I mean, I'm a Central Maine Power customer, and frankly, between my bill and my reliability of electrical service, I'm not a very happy customer. So is that what led to this? Is that why this effort is underway?
So I think Central Maine Power's customer service failures are definitely well known and well recorded, well documented. There are issues in Versant territory as well. So I think that's part of what inspired people like myself and Representative Seth Berry, Gordon Weil, former public advocate, to look at other options and what might work better for Maine people. But honestly, and I know you're going to talk about this later with another guest, the economics are just not in our favor. I mean, we have the 10th highest rates in the country. We're paying a lot of money for service that is not good. We have literally the worst reliability. That means the most power outages and the longest power outages of anywhere in the country. And that is after storms are removed. So that's just your everyday, are your lights on reliability. So we are paying quite a lot for very bad service. And at the root of that is the economic model. And I will not be the expert on that for your audience today, but I think I first came to it wondering, how can we have better service and more affordable service for my constituents? And then I found that as we're going to invest more in the grid, we just cannot simply afford to keep paying the rates that we're paying for the amount of electricity that we're going to be needing to use in the next decades.
Okay. All right. So, and it's always interesting to me, like, it seems like electricity is really a necessity. It's a public service. It's not like I'm deciding to go out and buy a swimming pool. It's something that none of us can survive without. And so, or it would be very difficult to survive in today's world without. So it's interesting. Just dig a little bit more into the investor owned. So when something is investor owned, then they're responsible, you said, is to their shareholders, right? Because they're supposed to make a profit. But in a consumer owned, does that mean that the government will own it? The government will take it over?
So to the first question, yes. So it is their fiduciary responsibility as board members of an investor in utility to maximize profit for those utility shareholders. So a lot of decisions are made around what kind of infrastructure can we build that will get us the most return on our investment. So we see a lot more interest in transmission infrastructure than your local poles and wires, which is part of what causes the reliability issue. It's usually not a big transmission line going down. It's something that's happening in your neighborhood or in your region. So we see that investment is happening, but it is skewed to where they can make more money. So that's a real problem for your, ratepayers. In the consumer-owned model, any extra money that is made goes right back into service, can go into dividends. And in fact, I have, in this whole process of research, I've learned about a lot of people that I didn't realize had consumer ownership, including a great aunt of mine who lives in Massachusetts. And she actually gets a dividend every year on her tax bill that reduces her taxes. And interestingly, she can now get high-speed internet at a very affordable rate, probably half of what most of your viewers are paying, because her consumer and utility decided that in addition to providing the critical service of electricity, we now know that, broadband is also a critical utility, and they wanted to get into that business and can offer that for their customers as well. So it's really, with the consumer ownership model, whatever best serves the consumers is the goal of the board to provide for them.
Okay. So this seems like it makes a lot of sense. I can imagine that Central Maine Power and Versant are going to oppose it pretty strongly. But so it passed in the legislature. And then, so tell us where it's positioned now. What do we have to do to make this happen now?
Sure. And thank you for mentioning about the legislature. So we did have a historic bipartisan vote in both the House and the Senate where legislation to create the Pine Tree Power Company, the consumer and utility for all Maine people that are not already served by consumer ownership, did pass. And it was really exciting to see that because it's, as you pointed out, we're up against some very strong and powerful foes. Unfortunately, the governor didn't agree that the timing was right or that the solution was quite right, although she did acknowledge that we have a lot of problems and that consumer ownership may be the solution at some point. To me, I feel that the problems have been going on for long enough and it's time to put our foot down. And the transition process is well regulated in the language of the legislation so that it won't take that long. We do expect lawsuits, but it is very strict in the time frame in the courts. So because the legislature did succeed, but was shut down by the executive branch with this legislation, we are now taking it to the legislature of the whole of the people of Maine by bringing that to the ballot by collecting signatures. We'll be starting this election day. So hopefully you'll see volunteers at the polls with Our Power, signs, and they'll be interested to talk to you and hear more about what have your challenges been with your utility. Once you start talking to people about these sort of things,
a lot of conversations.
Stories like, why did my power go out 14 times on a sunny day? And I called and there was no car accident and nobody really knew what was going on. These are the sort of things I hear from constituents in my region. So we are excited to be launching the Citizens Initiative and giving the people the authority to make this decision about their energy future.
That's awesome. So this would take it from the hands of a corporation and put it into the hands of people. So this would not be, this would not be the first time this has been done in the nation. This is a tried and tested model across the country, right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, like I mentioned, there are consumer-owned utilities in Maine. The state of Nebraska actually has 100% consumer-owned utilities and has had that since I believe it was the 20s or 30s. And there have been other places where utilities have transitioned from investor-owned to consumer-owned. And in those cases, they've seen the immediate reduction of rates, but also the ability to invest in things that mattered to their actual consumers.
Thank you for your leadership on this, and thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to seeing people at the polls collecting signatures. Thanks, Nicole.
We look forward to seeing you all.
Sign up. All right. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. So I'm pleased to welcome with us Rich Silkman, who is the CEO of Competitive Energy Services. He's a PhD in economics, and he is a national expert on the regulation of public utilities. He has developed wind, solar, and natural gas projects. And he is also someone who I knew back in the late 80s when we were both 10 as a key advisor and head of state planning for Governor Jock McKernan. Rich, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Sure, Betsy. We look just as young as we did then.
Oh, we absolutely. So, Rich, so can you just sort of break it down for us a little bit about why, as a consumer-owned utility, a good economic deal for Mainers?
It all boils down to the cost of capital, is what a company has to pay in order to borrow money, because ultimately the electric grid is very capital intensive and requires lots of investments. When you build a transmission line, it can run, as the NECEC line shows, $1 billion. CMP over the next 20 or 30 years, or maybe Maine more generally over the next 20 or 30 years, is going to have to spend probably close to $5 billion, maybe more, to upgrade its grid in order to handle beneficial electrification. That is all of us plugging in our cars, heating our homes with heat pumps rather than gas furnaces or oil furnaces. And then also to handle all the renewable generation that's going to have to be developed in order to support that, including lots of solar and offshore wind. So just like, when we all went from one-car families to two-car families, we had to build more roads to handle it. When we now beneficially electrify the society, we have to build more transmission grids, and that's going to require investments. So if you can make those investments at a cheap cost, there's borrow money less expensively, then the cost will be much less for you to do this than it otherwise would. And ultimately, a consumer-owned utility, or what Pine Tree Power is going to be, a municipal, that entity can borrow money at around 1/3 the cost of what it costs a company like CMP or its parents, Avangrid and Iberdrola, to borrow money at. And if we can borrow money less expensively, then we can build out our grid less expensively than CMP would otherwise do it, and Versant as well. This formula is nothing new to CMP or to Maine. There are lots of consumer-owned utilities around the country, some in Maine, but most of them in the Midwest, some of them in big cities like Austin and Sacramento and Chattanooga that own their own utilities. And they are borrowing money today to build out those grids at a much lower cost. And that's ultimately the economics of the situation. There are other advantages like community control or localized control, better decision making, more responsive to customer service, those kinds of things that we see across the country with consumer-owned utilities versus investor-owned utilities, and those will flow as well. But from my perspective, the primary driver is economics.
Okay, great. So let's talk for a minute about that local control piece, because there's sort of this movement that I've been hearing about called Yes in My Backyard, right? Which is trying to say that we really have to take this, what has become a very centralized and moving energy across the country from Quebec, for example, to Massachusetts. But if we are using alternative energy, more solar, more wind, that there's a real opportunity to regionalize it in much even smaller than a state areas where people could actually own, and we wouldn't have to spend so much money on that transmission. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of that kind of regionalization, or what you think is that in our future?
Yeah, and I think that's being oversold.
Okay.
The problem with the grid, and people I think will come to grips with it when we see what happens with beneficial electrification. But just take Portland, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that Portland can power itself.
Yeah.
I mean, you put a solar on the buildings and maybe they'll cover 5% of the use of the building.
Okay.
You put it on your house, it may cover 100% over the course of the year, but in Portland, there's no way that can happen. And so, because it's just too dense and there's not enough rooftop.
Yeah.
And so in those instances, you have to bring very large amounts of power into the city, which is going to require very significant transmission lines. Now, once you build that transmission line, it really doesn't matter much for the people around Portland, whether it connects to solar projects in Hiram and Parsons Field, or it connects to solar projects in Vermont or Hydro-Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it might matter in terms of folks who live in Hydro-Quebec and Vermont, but from our perspective, it really doesn't matter much. I do think that one of the movements, or one of the things that the movements towards solar and wind will do is it will allow states like Maine at writ large to become more energy independent. Mm-hmm. That is, our heating is not coming from oil fields in Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or even Texas. Our heating is now coming from solar plants in Maine or offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. So in that sense, yes, in my backyard makes sense, and that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. But in terms of being able to avoid transmission, probably not.
Okay, all right. Okay, but more localized, less far to go.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for breaking this down for us, those of us who are economics neophytes. And I really appreciate it. And thank you for your time and for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome, Betsy. It's my privilege. Thank you.
So I'm so happy to have with us Julia St. Clair and Emily Rochford, who are both with Maine Youth for Climate Justice. Julia is an organizer with them, and Emily is a senior at Unity College. And both of them have been working on climate change for some time. And thank you both very much for being with us. I really appreciate you taking time out to be here. Emily, let me start with you. So tell me a little bit just why you got interested in climate change and why you got interested in environmental stuff, just in general.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Betsy. And I, like you said, I'm a senior at Unity. I'm in the Sustainable Energy Management program. And that was just something kind of looking towards the future and the climate crisis that we're in. And I really kind of wanted to make a difference for my future and my peers, just kind of looking for that sustainability in a way that we can kind of move from this climate crisis. And I really got involved with NYCJ just because it was kind of this big group of like-minded young folks that were really passionate about, the climate and climate change and just kind of initiating climate justice for a lot of folks.
And Julia, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Maine, and I went to college in New York City. I got degrees in photography and environmental studies, and I think that sort of intersection for me of the visual understandings of climate change were really my first orientation. For my photography thesis, I focused on a pipeline project in Western Massachusetts, and through that sort of got involved in activism around energy projects. So for me, coming back to Maine, it made a lot of sense to get involved with Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and was really inspiring and uplifting to see a lot of young folks working together to organize. And what I think is unique too about these youth organizers is we just do not accept the status quo. We know that it's not enough, that we need to be advocating for more serious structural changes, and also that we recognize that climate change is a widely intersectional issue too. So we need to be considering all of the solutions that we're coming up with in a more holistic way.
Awesome. I love that, not tinkering on the edges, but we've got to do it like, I had a young person say to me, what's wrong with all of you? Why aren't you acting like this is the crisis that it is? So I really appreciate that activism. So we're talking about a consumer-owned utility, going from a profit, investor-owned utility to consumer-owned. So tell me how you see that as related to climate justice and the work that you care so much about? Emily?
Yeah, I definitely think kind of jumping, from climate justice into kind of the energy sector, talking about the consumer and utility, it really is an energy justice issue. And if we're looking at kind of making that sustainable future and switching to renewable energy, we really need to be making that accessible for all kinds of people. We need to make that clean energy, and we need to broaden it. As we look towards the future, we really need to electrify everything. And part of that is, putting it into our grid. Right now, we've seen kind of no action from CMP and Versant and the current investor-owned utilities that we have. And I just feel like there's a lot lacking, kind of what we're saying, this is a time to take action. It's not a time to set policies for the future. It's a time to do something now. Yeah. So I think this consumer-owned utility is really a concrete example of, we can take local investment into our grid and say, we're going to take ownership of it. This is a cause that's important to us. We need to update our grid infrastructure. We need to implement renewable energy, and we need to do it now.
So Julia, does this seem like an example for you of something that is more structural in change and not so much just tinkering around the edges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a complete overhaul of our current system, right? So we're not going to tackle climate change with this for-profit model that we currently have. CMP and Versant are beholden to their shareholders. They're not beholden to Maine's people or the planet as a whole. And I think both CMP and Versant have shown that they are not willing to take the steps necessary to reduce carbon emissions, to prepare our grid for a changing climate. And we've actually seen them sort of combat a lot of these changes. And I think what's really important about having a consumer-owned utility is sort of putting that decision-making power into the hands of Maine people, and thus this next generation of Mainers who are going to bear most of the impacts of climate change. So I think in doing that, we're really allowing the users of this energy, the people who are most impacted by climate change, this next generation, to have the ability to make the informed and transparent decisions about where energy is coming from and having accountability in these decisions as well.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I always think about somebody, an investor in Qatar, who doesn't really care whether my electricity was off for 2 days or not. It's just not. So I think that's a piece that we have to pay attention to. So 2 questions. One is, how do you think we can get more people, especially young people, interested and involved in this kind of specific issue? And 2, would either of you or both of you be willing to run to be one of the people, one of the owners, one of the consumer representatives that would be part of ruling Pine Tree Power?
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think that's a great opportunity just to be an owner, of my own power company. I'm paying the bills, so it's nice to kind of have a say in that as well. And yeah, there are tons of opportunities for folks, especially young folks, to get involved. Last year during the legislative session, we had a great youth lobby day. We had a whole bunch of young folks show up in Augusta at the State House, and that was really impactful. A lot of legislators and just folks, in that area were saying how great it was to see so many young people taking action. Right now, a really big thing is we are recruiting volunteers to collect signatures for our ballot campaign. So that's definitely something, even if you're a young person and aren't registered to vote, we can definitely use folks to kind of help with that effort. To reach out to folks, kind of walk around and be that extra support person. So that's definitely a really great opportunity, kind of boots on the ground, really help getting involved with this effort.
Awesome. So Julia, people can help by collecting signatures and being support. And would you consider running and being part of this ownership?
I hadn't thought about it, and honestly, my vote is for Emily. Absolutely.
Not fair.
But I would consider it. Yeah. I just want to touch back on that youth lobby day, because for me that was really exciting. It was my first time up in Augusta. It was, I think most of our group, it was their first time up in Augusta, and it was a way to actually have real human conversations with our representatives and legislators. So that felt really exciting and also really empowering. And I think we had a lot of actually pretty productive conversations that day as well. So it felt really successful. We held a press conference. For me, it was really exciting to see some of the younger members of our group be up there and just using their voices loud and proud. I found myself a lot more nervous. So that was really exciting for me. I'd love to see us be able to do more sort of direct conversations with people about making these sort of changes. But I also think one thing that's been really important, especially for young folks, especially in a pandemic where a lot of us are still, working from home or on our computers all day, is young people have been really proactive about writing LTEs and op-eds. And I think that's also a really great way of putting your voice out into your local community as a young person, saying this is something that I care about and I want you all to listen as well. So that's been another really important thing for NYCJ. We actually have an LTE guide if other young folks are interested in writing letters in support of the consumer-owned utility.
Awesome. So we will put the contact information and how to get in touch with Maine Youth for Climate Justice in the credits. So please take a look, and you can join Julia and Emily in their incredible work on climate change and on our power. So thank you for the work that you do. And really, thanks for being with us on Maine Challenge. So I was walking by this old CMP substation near my house when I realized how mad I am about this CMP and Versant campaign in favor of the corridor. And it's not for the reasons you might think. I could talk about how mad I am that this whole campaign has cost more than $70 million on both sides. Just think what we could do for green energy and climate if we invested that money in something else. We could even buy 10,000 Maine families a heat pump, for God's sake. But no, it's going to terrible ads and mail pieces. But that's not what I'm really mad about. I could also talk about the fact that the 50 million plus that CMP and Versant are spending is coming from our pockets, from the extraordinarily high rates that you and I pay for electricity, some of the highest in the nation. I could talk about how mad I am about that, but that's sort of a money and politics question, and that's for another time. And that's not even what I'm maddest about. Can you believe it? The thing I am most angry about is how this campaign for the no side has pivoted from being about energy and a corridor to being about anti-government. You've seen the ads. You have to be friggin' under a rock or dead to not see it, right? The ads are all about how terrible government is, how untrustworthy the legislature is, that they're gonna come after your business and your small business and even your job, that terrible legislature, that terrible government. Because, they can't win on the corridor issue. So now they are trying to mine and stir up this sort of cynicism against government that actually started under Ronald Reagan and has hopefully reached its pinnacle under Donald Trump. But if the pandemic has taught us nothing, it's how important it is that we see government as a good thing, as a source of good. And we are just starting to crawl out and be able to start to have people see that. And then bam, comes $50 million worth of ads saying, no, let's get at that cynicism. Let's destroy democracy even further. Just once, I wish these corporations would take a little bit of responsibility for what's going to happen to our democracy. But they don't care. They don't have to. These are foreign companies with foreign investors. In Qatar, they don't really care about our democracy. But I do, and you should. So what are we going to do about this? Well, I don't know, but one thing I do know is that the money and the anti-government stuff that's being spewed now is going to be child's play compared to when we put on the ballot the idea of making CMP a consumer-owned utility. That is going to make it even worse. So I say we stop it now. How do we do that? We call it out. We talk to our friends and neighbors, and we make sure that they see this insidious, horrible anti-government thing that they are just perpetuating. That's our job. And that's what we need to do. And when you go to the polls on November 2nd, make sure you sign the petition to put a consumer-owned utility, our power, on the ballot for next time.